My family surprised me with a birthday dinner, but the cake said, "Oops, still a disappointment." Everyone laughed except me. I got up calmly, took my bag, and left, but not before whispering something to my uncle. 2 weeks later, they were blowing up my phone in a panic because the cake said it in red icing, cursive, like it was something to be proud of. "Oops, still a disappointment." My whole family laughed. My own mother laughed hardest, one hand pressed flat against her chest like she'd just heard the funniest joke of her life. Dean was already filming on his phone, angling it to catch my face. I turned 32 that night. Rosewood Grill, the private room in the back my parents had rented, the one with the exposed brick and the good lighting, so all the relatives could see how generous the Hartwells were. Linen napkins folded into little fans. A bottle of Prosecco nobody had offered to pour for me yet. I sat there in the green dress I'd bought myself for the occasion, because nobody else was going to. 12 people around that table, all waiting to see if I'd cry. I didn't. I smiled, picked up my water glass, and took a slow sip, and I watched my mother's smile falter just slightly at the edges because she'd expected tears, and tears she did not get. My name is Rachel Hartwell. I'm a forensic auditor. 11 years finding money that other people were certain would stay hidden forever. For banks, for law firms, for insurance companies untangling fraud claims, money always leaves a shadow of itself behind, even when the money is gone. That's the whole secret of my job, and nobody in my family had ever once asked me what my job actually was. They just called me the boring one, the one who played it safe, the one who filed taxes on time and had a Roth IRA and had never, not once, been arrested, sued, evicted, or featured in a local news segment about a Ponzi scheme gone wrong, unlike my brother, who had come dangerously close to 2 of those 4. Dean is 35. He calls himself an investor on Instagram, where he has 41,000 followers and a bio that says built from nothing, twice. He drives a black BMW he cannot actually afford. On a lease he is 3 payments behind on, and wears a watch that costs more than 4 months of my rent. He has never once in his entire life built anything from nothing. Our father built it for him, over and over, and then let him call it self-made. My father, Gary Hartwell, is 61 and owns a small chain of auto parts stores that he inherited from his own father and has run into mediocrity for 3 decades. 6 months before that birthday, he'd paid off Dean's car loan, $11,000, and told everyone at Thanksgiving it was a business opportunity, an investment in Dean's new venture. Nobody at that table asked what the venture was. Nobody ever asks Dean anything. Questions are for people like me. My mother, Carol, is the one who picked the cake message. I found this out later from the bakery clerk, a 19-year-old named Priya, who told me, apologetically, like she knew exactly how it had landed, that my mother had stood at the counter dictating the words letter by letter and laughing the whole time she did it because she thought it was clever. A callback, she probably told herself. An inside joke, the kind loving families have. "Don't be so sensitive, Rachel," my mother said that night, watching me stare at the red icing. "You've always taken things too personally, as if there were a correct, appropriately sized amount of personally to take being told in frosting at your own birthday dinner that you were still like it was an ongoing project, a disappointment." I want to be honest about something, because the honest version of this story is better than the neat one. I had known for 6 months that my family was capable of ugliness. I had documentation of it. What I hadn't known until that cake was how casually they could deliver it, how much it would cost them to say it out loud, dressed up as a joke, in front of 12 people who all laughed on cue like a laugh track had been cued. That's the part that still sits wrong with me, if I'm honest. Not the cruelty, the ease of it. 6 months before the cake, my Aunt Denise had asked me a favor. Denise is my mother's younger sister, 58, a retired school librarian who'd spent the last 4 years managing a body that kept quietly failing her, a heart condition that required 3 medications a day and regular monitoring, on top of the rheumatoid arthritis that had already taken her ability to drive at night. Her husband, my Uncle Walt, had died 4 years earlier and left behind a trust, modest by wealthy people standards, substantial by ours, meant to cover Denise's medical care for the rest of her life and to fund college for her 2 grandkids, Mia and Toby, when the time came. Walt had named my father as co-trustee. That had seemed reasonable at the time. Gary was family. Gary ran a business. Gary understood money. Denise didn't have the energy, in her grief, to argue about it. She called me on a Tuesday evening in January, and I almost didn't pick up. "Rachel, honey," she said, "I don't want to make this a whole thing, but something feels off with the trust statements, and I don't know who else to ask that I'd actually trust to tell me the truth." That last part mattered more than she probably realized. Not trust to be nice, trust to be accurate, even if accurate was ugly. "Send me what you have," I told her. "I'll look at it quietly. No promises on what I'll find." She sent me 11 months of statements 2 days later, scanned on her home printer. Slightly crooked, the way things get scanned by people who grew up mailing letters. I opened the first one at my kitchen table with a cup of coffee and the specific low-grade dread that comes from doing this job long enough to recognize a shape before you've even confirmed what it is. The numbers didn't sit right. That's the phrase we use in the industry, and it undersells what actually happens, which is closer to your eyes snagging on something the way your tongue finds a chipped tooth automatically before you've decided to look for it. There were consulting fees, quarterly, to a firm called Meridian Strategic Partners for portfolio advisory services. I'd been doing this long enough to know that real advisory firms have real prints, state registration, a compliance history, a physical address that shows up on more than one document. Meridian Strategic Partners had a website that had been live for 14 months, a logo that looked like it had been made in 20 minutes, and an address that, when I looked it up, turned out to be a UPS store in a strip mall 2 towns over from where my parents live. I didn't say anything to to anyone. Not yet. I built the file the way I'd been trained to. Quiet, patient, one document at a time, because a case built in anger has holes in it, and a case built in silence is airtight. It took 4 months. The first loop of the escalation started small, the way they always do. I requested the underlying invoices for the Meridian fees, not from my father. I wasn't ready to tip my hand, but from the bank directly. Using authorization Denise signed as beneficiary. The bank's compliance department took 3 weeks to respond, and when they did, the invoices were exactly the kind of thing you produce when you've never actually invoiced anyone for anything. No itemized services, no hourly breakdown, just a flat number and a generic line, Q1 advisory services, typed in a font that didn't match the letterhead above it. I told myself it might be sloppy bookkeeping. People are lazy. Lazy isn't criminal. Then I found the second thing. The wire transfers from the trust to Meridian didn't land at a business account. I traced the routing numbers. This part takes patience and a working relationship with people at the bank who owe you favors, and I had both, and found that Meridian's account had been opened 18 months earlier by an individual signatory, not a business entity, a person. The person was Dean. My stomach did the thing it does, the thing I felt maybe 6 times in 11 years, where it doesn't drop so much as go still, like the floor tilted and my body hasn't caught up yet. I sat with that stillness for a long time before I let myself think the next thought, which was, my father authorized these transfers, co-trustee. His signature, 4 times on withdrawal authorizations totaling, at that point I still didn't have the full number, a great deal of money that was supposed to be paying for Denise's medication and her grandkids' education. I called Denise's cardiologist's office 2 days later, not to ask about her condition. That wasn't my business and wasn't my question, but because I needed to confirm something for the file. Whether her insurance had covered a medication she'd mentioned rationing. It hadn't, fully. She'd been splitting doses since January, the same month she'd first called me. I sat in my car in a pharmacy parking lot after I found that out and didn't drive anywhere for 11 minutes. My hands were doing a thing on the steering wheel, a small tremor, not dramatic, just there, the body keeping score before the mind finishes doing the math. I fixed nothing that day. I couldn't. Confronting my father with half a file would just give him 4 months to build a cover story, and I'd seen what happened to cases that moved too early, so I went home and kept building. The second loop came when I pulled the tax filings. Meridian Strategic Partners had never filed a return. Not an LLC filing, not a 1099 issuance, nothing on record with the state. A business that had, on paper, been paid over 6 figures for advisory work had no tax footprint whatsoever, which meant either extraordinary incompetence or the much simpler explanation, which was that it wasn't a business receiving payment for services. It was a name Dean had put on a bank account so that money could move from one place to another and look, to a glancing eye, legitimate. I called a colleague of mine, Preeti Nair, a forensic accountant I'd worked with on 2 prior cases, 12 years in fraud examination, the kind of person who reads a spreadsheet the way other people read a novel, and asked her, without giving her names, to sanity check my read on a Shell invoicing pattern. She confirmed what I already suspected. No legitimate advisory relationship produces this document trail. Real fee-for-service work generates engagement letters, scopes of work, deliverables. This produced nothing but numbers moving from an account with a grieving widow's name on it into an account with my brother's signature on it. I told myself that week that maybe Dean didn't fully understand what he'd been asked to do. Maybe my father had structured all of it and Dean was just the name on the account, naive, in over his head the way Dean is naive and in over his head about most things. Then I found the text messages. Denise had given me access to Walt's old email archive, which she'd kept unopened since his death. She said she couldn't bear to close the account, and I didn't ask her to explain that. Buried in it, forwarded at some point from my father's email by mistake or by carelessness, was a message thread between Gary and Dean from 2 years earlier. Dad, the Meridian thing needs to look real if anyone ever asks. Get a website up at least. Dean, on it. What do I put as the address, Dad? Use the UPS box. It's fine. Nobody's gonna check this. I read that exchange 4 times, my hands doing the tremor thing again. Worse this time. Nobody's gonna check this. He'd been right for 2 years. He just hadn't accounted for the family he was stealing from, including a forensic auditor he'd spent a decade calling boring. I didn't confront him. I couldn't. Not yet. Not with a screenshot of an email thread I'd found through a chain of custody that wasn't clean, forwarded through channels that would raise chain of custody questions if this ever became a legal matter, which by this point I understood it eventually would. I needed the wire transfer records directly from the bank, properly subpoenaed if it came to that, not smuggled out of a dead man's inbox. I filed that thread away as confirmation for myself, not as evidence for anyone else, and kept working the parts of the case that would actually hold up. The third loop was the one that made me angriest, and it's the one I'm least proud of struggling with, because the anger almost made me move too fast. I found the total, $311,400, moved out of Denise's trust across 36 months in quarterly increments designed to look modest enough that nobody skimming a statement would flag any single transaction. The oldest trick in the book, and it had worked, because nobody had been looking except a librarian with a bad heart and a niece she'd finally thought to call. I sat with that number for 2 days before I could look at it without my chest doing something tight and unpleasant. $311,000. Denise had been splitting pills since January. Mia was 14 and Toby was 11, and there had been, according to Denise, a quiet conversation 8 months earlier about whether the college fund might need adjusting, phrased vaguely enough that Denise hadn't pushed, because Gary had always seemed to have things handled. I called my father, not to confront him. I want to be clear about that, because I've turned this decision over 100 times since, but because part of proper practice, part of of doing this the way I'd been trained to for 11 years is giving the subject of an inquiry a chance to explain themselves before you finalize anything. I asked him, in the most neutral voice I could manage, whether he remembered the specifics of the Meridian advisory arrangement for Denise's trust. He laughed. Actually laughed. The same register as my mother's cake laugh. Like the question itself was an amusing overreach on my part. Since when do you care about Denise's paperwork? He said. You're not her accountant, Rachel. I'm asking as family, I said, which was a lie. And I think he heard that it was a lie because there was a half-second pause before he answered. It's handled. Denise doesn't need to worry about the details. That's what I'm there for. That's what I'm there for. He said it like a man who believed it. I've come to think that's the most dangerous kind of person to build a case against. Not someone who knows they're the villain, but someone who has fully convinced himself he's still the responsible one, still the protector, even while the evidence of the opposite sits in a folder 6 inches from his hand. I hung up and tried to fix nothing else that week because I understood, finally and completely, that there was nothing left to fix through a phone call. The file was done. What remained wasn't investigation. It was delivery. The fourth loop was Denise herself, and this is the part that still catches in my throat a little when I think about it. I drove to her house on a Saturday in April, ostensibly to bring her a casserole, actually to look her in the eye while I decided how much to tell her and when. She met me at the door in a cardigan 2 sizes too big, the kind of thin that comes from stress and medication and stretching food further than it should stretch, and she hugged me the way she always does, both arms, a full 2 seconds longer than a casual hug. You didn't have to do all this digging, honey, she said, meaning the trust review, not knowing yet what the digging had actually found. I probably just misread a statement. I almost told her everything right there, standing in her kitchen with a casserole dish between us. I didn't, not because I doubted the facts, but because once I said the words out loud, there'd be no controlled way to manage what happened next. She'd call her sister. Her sister would call her husband. I'd lose whatever advantage came from choosing the moment myself. I told her instead that I thought there were some irregularities I wanted to confirm properly before I said anything that might turn out to be wrong. I watched her face do something complicated, relief that someone was looking, and underneath it, a flicker of fear she didn't say out loud, the fear of a woman who has already guessed quietly that the answer is going to be bad and has simply been waiting for someone else to say it first so she doesn't have to be the one who breaks her own family. Take your time, she said. I trust you. I drove home that night and sat in my car in my own driveway for a long time before I went inside because I trust you is a heavier sentence to carry than people realize when they say it lightly. The fifth loop, the last one before the cake, before everything moved, was the attorney. I'd known for weeks that the file needed a legal home before it needed anything else. My own findings, however solid, were an auditor's opinion. What Denise needed was representation. Someone who could formally request records with legal weight behind the request, someone who could petition to remove a trustee, someone whose letterhead alone would make the withdrawal authorization stop. I found Patricia Voss through a referral from Preeti, 19 years specializing in trust and estate litigation, a reputation, according to 2 people I asked, for being quiet right up until she wasn't. I called her office on a Wednesday and laid out the case in the dry, structured language I use for every audit report. Dates, amounts, entities, discrepancies. No adjectives, no mention of my father or my brother, just trustee and beneficiary and signatory, the way I'd learned to compartmentalize a case so the facts could stand on their own weight. Patricia listened for 11 minutes without interrupting me once. Then she said, "Send me everything you have. If this is what it sounds like, we're not talking about a family disagreement. We're talking about breach of fiduciary duty, and depending on how the funds were characterized on any tax filings, possibly fraud." I sent the file that afternoon. Bank statements, wire logs, the invoice discrepancies, the shell address documentation, everything except the forwarded email thread, which I flagged separately as background information not yet properly obtained, a distinction Patricia said mattered, and which I was relieved to hear her say mattered, because it meant she was as careful as I needed her to be. "I'll need a few weeks to prepare a formal demand," she told me. "In the meantime, say nothing. Do you understand? Nothing to your father, nothing to your brother. The moment they suspect this is coming, they start moving money or destroying records, and we lose leverage we can't get back." "I understand," I said. I did not fully understand, not yet, how hard saying nothing would be at a birthday dinner where the cake told me I was still a disappointment and my whole family laughed like I'd earned it. The night of the dinner, I almost didn't go. I sat in my car outside Rosewood Grill for 6 minutes, engine off, watching my breath fog the windshield in the March cold, running through everything Patricia had told me. Say nothing. Weeks, not days. The demand letter wasn't drafted yet. The trustee removal petition wasn't filed. If I said one wrong word tonight, if my face gave away one flicker of what I knew, I could unravel 4 months of careful, quiet work in a single evening. I went in anyway because not going would have raised its own questions, and questions were the one thing I couldn't afford yet. The private room smelled like garlic bread and my mother's perfume. 12 people. Linen napkins. My father at the head of the table, already 2 drinks in. Dean set up at the far end with his phone angled toward me before I'd even taken my coat off. Filming. Always filming. Building content out of a birthday dinner for a sister he'd stolen $311,000 from without, I would come to believe, ever once considering it that. The cake came out at 8:40. I remember the time because I'd glanced at my phone out of habit. The way you do when you're bracing for something and don't know what shape it will take. Red icing, cursive, oops, still a disappointment. The laugh that went around that table was the kind of laugh that has practiced itself over years. A family laugh. A shared muscle memory of finding my failures funny. My mother laughed hardest and longest, one hand on her chest, and I understood watching her that she had planned this, had stood in that bakery dictating the words letter by letter, letter, had thought about it, had chosen cruelty on purpose and packaged it as a joke so that if I objected, the objection itself would become the story. Rachel can't take a joke. Rachel's so sensitive. Rachel's overreacting again. I didn't cry. I want to be honest that some small, old part of me wanted to. The part of me that is still 9 years old and still wants my mother to like me. But the larger part of me, the part that had spent 4 months tracing a shell company through a UPS store, was doing something colder and more useful, which was watching my own hands to make sure they weren't shaking, because shaking hands would have been a tell, and I could not afford a tell. I smiled instead, took a slow sip of water, let the silence stretch just slightly longer than comfortable, because I had learned, across 11 years of interviews with people who thought they were smarter than a paper trail, that silence makes guilty people nervous in a way that crying never does. "Don't be so sensitive, Rachel," my mother said, into that silence, unable to leave it alone. "You've always taken things too personally." I stood up. My chair scraped the floor loud enough that 2 conversations at the far end of the table actually stopped. I didn't say anything to my mother. I didn't look at Dean, still filming, phone angled to catch whatever I did next for an audience of 41,000 strangers. I walked the length of that table instead, past my father's seat, past the half-eaten cake, to where my Uncle Walt's brother, my Uncle Ray, 70 years old, Denise's brother-in-law, who'd been quiet the whole dinner the way he'd been quiet at every family gathering since Walt died, a man everyone had stopped really looking at, sat near the end, closest to the door. I leaned down. I kept my voice low enough that only he could hear it. "Everything's all ready with Patricia Voss," I said, "Denise's lawyer. She'll be calling you and Denise both, probably within the week. I wanted you to hear it from me first, so you're not blindsided." Ray's fork stopped halfway to his mouth. His eyes, which had looked tired and far away all evening, sharpened into something else entirely. "Rachel," he started. "I have to go," I said. "Happy birthday to me." I straightened up, picked up my purse from the back of my chair, and walked out of Rosewood Grill without looking back at the table, without checking whether my mother's expression had changed, without giving Dean a single additional second of footage. The cold air outside hit me like the first real breath I'd taken in 3 hours. My phone was already buzzing before I got my car door open. Dean first, a text, not a call, which told me he was more concerned with managing his own image than actually reaching me. "What did you just say to Uncle Ray? Everyone's freaking out. You ruined the whole dinner." Then my mother, calling. I let it ring out. Then my father, who calls me maybe 4 times a year, calling twice in immediate succession. I turned my phone face down on the passenger seat and drove home through empty streets with the radio off, because I wanted to hear my own thoughts clearly, and my thoughts, for the first time in months, were quiet. I want to explain why I chose Ray specifically instead of confronting my father directly that night, because it wasn't an accident and it wasn't cowardice. Ray wasn't just Walt's brother. 2 years earlier, without much fanfare, Denise had quietly added him as a secondary beneficiary contact on the trust documentation, a failsafe, in case anything ever happened to her before Mia and Toby came of age, someone who'd be notified if the trust required attention. My father knew this. I don't think he'd ever expected it to matter, because he'd never expected anyone to be looking closely enough for a failsafe to activate. By telling Ray quietly at that dinner, I wasn't confronting my father. I was making sure that the moment Patricia's formal demand landed, whenever that turned out to be, there would already be a second family member aware and watching, someone my father couldn't simply pressure or gaslight into silence the way he might try with Denise alone. I was building redundancy into a case the same way I'd build redundancy into any audit. Never rely on a single point of failure. Never let one conversation be the only thing standing between the truth and the people who needed to hear it. I didn't know, driving home that night, that it would matter within 2 weeks. I only knew it felt like the right kind of insurance. 2 weeks passed in a silence that felt less like peace and more like the pause before a held breath gets released. I didn't call my parents. I didn't respond to Dean's texts, which arrived in bursts. Apologetic on Tuesday, defensive on Thursday, outright hostile by the following Monday, when he sent a paragraph accusing me of trying to destroy this family over a joke on a cake that I read twice and then didn't answer at all. I went to work. I closed out 2 other cases that had nothing to do with my family, because the discipline of an unrelated audit was, I found, oddly steadying. Numbers that owed me nothing, discrepancies that weren't personal. I talked to Pretty twice, off the record, mostly just to hear a colleague's voice confirm that the Meridian pattern was as clean a case as I thought it was. I did not talk to Patricia, because Patricia had told me she'd reach out when there was something to report, and I trusted her enough by then to actually wait. Then, on a Tuesday morning, April 21st, 9:14 a.m., I remember, because I was standing in my kitchen microwaving coffee I'd let go cold, an echo of the exact moment 6 months earlier when Denise had first called me. My phone rang with a number I didn't recognize. I almost didn't answer. I answered. Rachel, Patricia's voice, calm and clipped, the same register she'd used on our very first call. "We need to talk." The trustee removal petition went in Friday. The court reviewed the accompanying documentation over the weekend, and there's a call scheduled with your father's attorney in 1 hour. My stomach tightened, the old familiar stillness. "He's agreeing to appear?" "He's already agreed," Patricia said. "His attorney reached out first thing this morning," which tells you something on its own. Usually that means they've reviewed the exposure and understand fighting it publicly is worse than settling quietly. But there's something else. A pause, the kind she used deliberately, I'd learned, to make sure I was fully listening before she said the next thing. "Something in the bank's supplemental records that changes who else is implicated." "Who else?" I asked, gripping the phone hard enough that my knuckles went pale. The line went quiet for one long second, the kind of second that, in my line of work, usually means the person on the other end is deciding exactly how to phrase phrase something that's about to change everything. The bank's compliance department flagged a second signatory on the Meridian account who authorized 2 of the later withdrawals, Patricia said. Someone who isn't Dean. Who? My voice came out smaller than I wanted it to. Your mother, Patricia said. Carol authorized 2 wire transfers herself 11 months ago, totaling $42,000. Her signatures on file at the bank. She wasn't a passive bystander to this, Rachel. She was a participant. I sat down at my kitchen table because I needed to. Not because I was surprised exactly. Some cold auditor part of me had wondered quietly whether my mother's laughter at that cake had been the laughter of someone who genuinely thought a red icing joke was harmless, or the laughter of someone who knew at some level that her family's cruelty toward me had a much larger and uglier twin sitting in a bank ledger, and who found it easier to be cruel about something small than to sit with something enormous. What happens now? I asked. Now, Patricia said. The call in an hour isn't just about your father anymore. I'll be looping in Detective Foster from the Financial Crimes Unit. This crosses from civil breach into potential fraud territory once we can show intent. And 2 separate signatories moving trust funds into a shell account is exactly the kind of pattern that gets a detective's attention. I want you to be prepared for that. This isn't containable to a family conversation anymore. It's a case. Detective Marcus Foster had spent 17 years with the Financial Crimes Unit by the time Patricia brought him in, and I met him for the first time 3 days later in a conference room at Patricia's office that smelled like fresh coffee and printer toner. He was unhurried in a way I recognized, the specific calm of someone who has looked at hundreds of families falling apart over money and has learned not to let any single case rattle him, while still, somehow, treating each one like it mattered. Walk me through the trail the way you built it, he said. Start wherever makes sense to you. I did. The Meridian invoices, the UPS store address, the tax filings that didn't exist, the routing numbers that led to an account Dean had opened himself, the forwarded email thread I flagged again, clearly, as background context rather than properly obtained evidence. Foster took notes in a small spiral notebook, old-fashioned in a way that struck me as oddly reassuring, and asked precise questions. Not skeptical exactly, but testing, the way any good investigator tests a story for the places it might crack. You didn't confront either of them directly during any of this, he said at one point. Not quite a question. No, I said. I didn't want to compromise the record. I've seen what happens to cases where the subject gets tipped off early. Documents disappear, stories get coordinated. Foster looked up from his notebook, and for the first time since I'd met him, almost smiled. Most people in your position would have confronted their family the day they found the first bad invoice. You built a 4-month case instead. That's not normal restraint, Ms. Hartwell. That's professional instinct. It's my job, I said, and I meant it as simple fact, not modesty. He came back to me 2 days later with something I hadn't expected. The bank's fraud division, once formally engaged, had cross-referenced the Meridian account against a database of shell entity patterns and found that the UPS store address my father and brother had used had also been listed 18 months earlier on an unrelated small business loan application, one that had been approved on paper, based partly on invoices from Meridian Strategic Partners as proof of prior client revenue. My father hadn't just used the fake firm to drain Denise's trust. He'd used the fiction of the fake firm to help Dean secure additional financing elsewhere, building one lie on top of another the way people do when they've stopped being able to see the difference between a shortcut and a crime. This isn't isolated to your aunt's trust anymore, Foster told me in the same unhurried voice. We're looking at a broader pattern now. That loan application alone is enough for a separate fraud referral. The crisis peak came on a Thursday, 11 days after Patricia's first call, and it came all at once, the way these things apparently do once the dam actually breaks instead of just leaking. I had 24 hours notice. Patricia's office called at 4 p.m. Wednesday to tell me the joint hearing on the trustee removal petition, originally scheduled for the following week, had been moved up because opposing counsel had requested an emergency session once the bank's fraud referral came through, and my father's attorney realized delay was working against him rather than for him. The hearing was set for 10 a.m. Thursday. My testimony, as the auditor who'd built the underlying file, would very likely be needed. I didn't sleep much that night. I sat at my kitchen table reviewing my own documentation for the 4th time, checking dates against dates, making sure every figure in my summary matched the underlying bank records, because a single transposed number could become the thread a defense attorney pulled to unravel the whole thing. My mother called at 11 p.m. I almost didn't answer. I answered. Rachel. Her voice sounded different than I'd ever heard it. Not commanding, not dismissive, something closer to frightened. Patricia's office called your father's lawyer. They're saying, Rachel, they're saying I could be charged. Is that true? Can they actually do that? I sat with the phone against my ear for a long moment before I answered, because some old reflex in me wanted to comfort her, the same reflex that had wanted to cry at that birthday dinner instead of staying calm. I don't decide what they charge, Mom, I said. I just found what was actually in the records. What happens with that isn't up to me anymore. You did this, she said, and her voice cracked on the word did, somewhere between accusation and genuine grief. You're really going to let them destroy this family over money? I didn't move $42,000 out of a dying woman's medical trust, I said, and I kept my voice level, because level was the only thing I had left to give her. You did that. I just noticed. She hung up. I sat at my kitchen table with my cold coffee and my documentation spread out in front of me and let myself shake, finally, alone, where no one could see it and call it a tell. By 9:40 the next morning, standing outside the courthouse in a gray suit I'd chosen specifically because it was the least emotional thing in my closet, I watched my father get out of his car with his attorney, his face gray in a way I'd never seen it, the practiced ease he wore at every family dinner completely gone. Dean Dean wasn't there yet. My mother arrived separately, alone, and did not look at me once as she walked past. I had 24 hours to prepare, and I'd used every one of them. Whatever happened next in that courtroom, I understood, standing there in the cold morning light, that I had already done the only part that was actually mine to do. The hearing lasted 3 hours. I testified for 40 minutes of it, walking the judge and both attorneys through the same trail I'd walked Detective Foster through days earlier. Dates, amounts, routing numbers, the shell address that traced to a UPS store, the tax filings that had never existed. My voice held steady through all of it, which surprised me less than it might have, because by that point, the facts had become so familiar to me they'd stopped feeling like an attack and started feeling simply like the truth being read aloud. Patricia introduced the bank's supplemental fraud referral as Exhibit F. My father's attorney objected twice, on grounds that didn't ultimately matter, because the judge, a woman named Judge Alvarez, who spoke maybe 9 sentences the entire hearing, each one precise, overruled both objections and let the full record stand. By the end of the hearing, the judge granted the trustee removal petition outright, appointing an independent professional trustee, a fiduciary firm with no relationship to any of us, to take over management of Denise's trust immediately, with a freeze placed on any further disbursement pending the outcome of the criminal referral. My father was removed as co-trustee, effective that day. The civil judgment for restitution of the full $311,400 was entered against both my father and Dean, jointly, with my mother named separately in a supplemental filing tied specifically to the $42,000 bearing her signature. Detective Foster's Financial Crimes Unit opened a formal fraud investigation the same week, based on the shell invoicing pattern and the falsified small business loan application. My father was charged 8 weeks later with breach of fiduciary duty and 1 count of financial fraud. Dean was charged alongside him, the same 2 counts, plus an additional charge related to the loan application fraud. My mother ultimately was not criminally charged. The prosecutor's office determined her $42,000, while civilly actionable and clearly implicated in the broader scheme, didn't meet the threshold for criminal intent they could prove beyond reasonable doubt. But she was named in the civil restitution order regardless, and she surrendered the funds within the month, drawn, I later learned, from her and my father's joint retirement account. My father's business, the auto parts chain his own father had built, was quietly sold off within 4 months. Not seized, but sold, because once the fraud charges became public in the small town where he'd run it for 30 years, the customer base that had sustained 3 decades of mediocre business practice evaporated within weeks. Dean's Instagram account, the 41,000 followers, the built from nothing, twice bio. It's still up, technically, but he stopped posting the week the charges were filed, and the comments on his last video, when I checked once and never checked again, were not kind. I want to be honest about the part that doesn't feel like triumph, because I think that's the part people skip when they tell stories like this one, and I don't want to skip it. Denise got her money back, the full restitution, plus the trust itself now properly managed by professionals who file real invoices for real work. She's no longer splitting her medication. Mia and Toby's college funds are intact, verified, monitored. That part is unambiguously good, and I do all 4 months of quiet work again tomorrow to get there, but my mother doesn't speak to me. My father, from what Denise tells me, has said my name exactly once since the sentencing. A plea deal, ultimately, 18 months probation and full restitution rather than jail time. And what he said was that I'd chosen a stranger's money over my own family, which I've turned over in my head more times than I want to admit, because there's a version of that sentence that almost sounds true if you don't look at it too closely. And looking at it closely is the entire job I do for a living. Dean texted me once, 4 months after the sentencing, a single line, "Hope you're happy." I didn't answer. I'm not sure happy is the right word for what I am. Something closer to settled, something closer to finally being able to sit in a room with my own family's cruelty without lynching. Because I know now, with total documentary certainty, that the cruelty was never actually about me being too sensitive. It was about them needing someone to be smaller so the rest of them could feel large. I still see Ray sometimes. He calls me every few weeks just to talk. No agenda. The first member of my family, I've realized, who's ever called me for a reason other than needing something. He told me once that the thing he remembers most from that whole birthday dinner wasn't the cake. It was watching my hands steady on the water glass, while everyone around me laughed at something they thought had broken me. "You weren't broken," he said. "You were building something." I just didn't understand what yet. I turned 33 3 weeks ago. I had dinner alone at a small Italian place near my apartment. No linen napkins rented to impress anyone. No cake at all. I ordered tiramisu for one and ate the whole thing slowly, and nobody watched me to see if I'd cry. I didn't. There was nothing left in that particular account to cry about. Just the quiet, steady arithmetic of a life finally balanced correctly. The kind of balance you only get by refusing for 4 long months to let anyone rush you into announcing the truth before you were certain it would hold.